They found the table first, still set, still waiting beneath 6 feet of church foundation and 200 years of consecrated ground. The excavators hit wood, not a coffin, but something worse, a dining table, and around it, in positions that made the crew stop working and call someone who wasn't a contractor, sat what remained of the Devlin family, all 9 of them, hands folded, heads bowed, preserved in the cold clay soil of western Pennsylvania like insects in amber, frozen in the act of saying grace over a meal they never finished. The silverware was still in their hands. This isn't folklore. This isn't campfire mythology whispered through generations until the truth dissolved into legend. This is documented, photographed, catalogued by the Somerset County Historical Preservation Board in March of 2019, when the old Prospect Hill Church was being demolished to make room for a parking structure that will never be built now. Because what they found underneath changed everything we thought we knew about one of Pennsylvania's founding families. And what happened in that room, that cold, earthen room that was never supposed to be opened, tells a story about American family life that doesn't make it into textbooks. The Devlins weren't poor, they weren't outcasts. Jonathan Devlin owned 400 acres of farmland, held a seat on the township council, and his wife Catherine was a direct descendant of one of William Penn's original land grant families. They were respectability itself. Church every Sunday, harvest dinners for the entire community, the kind of family other families measured themselves against, which makes what happened in 1887 so much harder to accept. Because when people like the Devlins disappear, when they vanish from record and memory so completely that even their property deed gets transferred to the county without explanation, without inquiry, someone made that happen. Someone with enough power to erase 9 human lives and convince an entire town to forget they ever existed. And now we know why. The excavation crew found them on a Tuesday morning. The foreman, a man named David Kelso who'd been doing demolition work for 30 years, said later in his deposition that he knew something was wrong before they even broke through. The ground radar had shown an anomaly, a void space where there shouldn't have been one, directly beneath where the church altar had stood for 132 years. They assumed it was a crypt. Old churches always had them, places where reverends and deacons were laid to rest in lead-lined boxes, close to God even in death. But when the hydraulic drill punched through the limestone cap, the smell that came up wasn't decomposition. It was older than that, mineral, earthen, like opening a cave that had been sealed since the last ice age. What they lowered the camera into wasn't a crypt, it was a room. 12 feet by 14 feet, walls made of stacked fieldstone, mortared with something that later testing would reveal contained ash, lime and trace amounts of human bone meal. The ceiling was intact, wood beams hand-hewn, still bearing the chisel marks of whoever built them. And in the center of that room, under 2 centuries of absolute darkness, sat the Devlins at their final meal. The table was black walnut, custom built. You could still see the maker's mark burned into the underside. A local craftsman named Elias Pritt, whose workshop ledger from 1884 confirms a commission from Jonathan Devlin for own dining table, 8 chairs, suitable for family gatherings of significant occasion. 3 years later, those chairs would hold corpses, not scattered, not fallen, seated, arranged. The children, there were 5 of them, ranging from 4 years old to 16, were positioned by height, smallest to tallest, along the right side of the table. Jonathan sat at the head, Catherine at the foot, and between them, in the 2 remaining chairs, sat Jonathan's brother Marcus and Catherine's sister Abigail, neither of whom officially lived in the Devlin household, but both of whom disappeared from census records on the exact same date as the rest of the family, November 14, 1887. That's the last time anyone in Prospect Hill, Pennsylvania reported seeing any member of the Devlin family alive. The township meeting minutes from November 21st make a single reference to Jonathan's absence, marked as regrettable but understood given family circumstances. No one elaborated, no one asked questions, and by December, the Devlin farmhouse had been quietly purchased by a consortium of local landowners who tore it down before winter and planted the field with ryegrass that nothing would grow in for the next 40 years. The church was built directly over the room in 1891, 4 years after the Devlins disappeared. The congregation's founding charter lists 23 families, including every member of that land consortium, and the first reverend, a man named Silas Coordinator who came from Philadelphia with no prior ministry experience, wrote in his private journal, discovered in 2003 during an estate sale, that his position came with specific spiritual obligations regarding what lies beneath and the maintenance of silence as our highest covenant. They knew, all of them. The entire town knew. The plates were still full. That's what made the forensic team stop and photograph everything before they touched anything. Each plate held food, preserved by the mineral-rich clay soil and the sealed environment into something that looked less like a meal and more like a museum exhibit of what human beings once ate: potatoes, carrots, what appeared to be venison or beef, cut into small, deliberate portions, and on every plate in the exact center, a piece of bread that laboratory analysis would later identify as containing flour, water, salt, and something else, something organic, something that the lab report lists only as unidentified biological compound, human origin, awaiting further DNA sequencing. The children's plates had smaller portions, proportional to their ages. The youngest, a girl named Prudence, who was 4 years old according to baptism records, had her food cut into pieces small enough for tiny hands to manage. Someone had done that for her. Someone had taken the time to prepare this meal with the same care a mother would take on any ordinary evening, making sure each child could eat without struggle, without mess. Except none of them ate. Not a single fork had disturbed the food. Not a single knife had cut into the meat. The silverware was positioned in their hands, held, not gripped, as if placed there after they'd already stopped moving. The toxicology reports took 9 months. The state forensic lab had to run the tests 3 times because the results didn't make sense with any known poisoning protocol. What they found in the tissue samples, and there was still tissue, leathered and dark but intact enough for analysis, was a cocktail of compounds that included arsenic, mercury, nightshade alkaloids, and something they couldn't identify at all. Something plant-based. Something that doesn't exist in any modern botanical database. The concentration levels were precise, calculated. Each family member had ingested an amount specifically calibrated to their body weight, delivered in doses that suggested weeks of gradual administration, not a single lethal meal. They were dying long before they sat down at that table. The meal was theater. But here's what makes it worse. Here's what the forensic odontologist discovered when examining the jaw positioning and throat tissue of the adult remains. They were still breathing when they were sealed in. Not all of them dead. Not even most of them. The calcium deposits in the lung tissue, the way the ribs were positioned, the trace evidence of hemorrhaging in what remained of the soft palate. It all pointed to the same conclusion. Some of them were alive when the room was closed, when the stones were mortared into place, when the earth was packed on top and the foundation poured above them. And based on the degradation patterns in the muscle tissue and the position of the hands, they stayed alive for hours, maybe days, sitting at that table in absolute darkness, too weak from the poison to move, too coherent to lose consciousness, feeling their children die in the chairs beside them while they waited for their own bodies to finish the process. The bread on their plates was never meant to be eaten. It was communion, a final sacrament in a ritual that someone had planned down to the last terrible detail. The Devlins came to Pennsylvania in 1799. Jonathan's great-grandfather, William Devlin, arrived from County Clare with a land grant signed by the Commonwealth and a reputation that the historical record handles carefully. He was a physician, trained in Edinburgh, specializing in what the medical journals of the time called disorders of melancholy and inherited madness, which meant he ran a private asylum, not the kind listed in city directories, the kind that wealthy families paid to make their problems disappear into, the kind where people went in through locked doors and came out through unmarked graves in fields that would later be sold as farmland. William Devlin purchased his 400 acres with money that had no clear origin point, no inheritance, no business venture, just sudden, substantial wealth that appeared in 1801, 2 years after his arrival, documented in a single bank deposit in Philadelphia that would be worth approximately $4 million today. The land he bought had been surveyed 3 times and rejected each time as unsuitable for cultivation. Too much limestone, too acidic, prone to sinkholes and groundwater contamination. But William didn't farm it. He built a single structure, large enough for 30 occupants, with reinforced stone walls and windows that opened from the outside only. The county records call it a private hospital for nervous disorders. The letters between William and his colleagues in Edinburgh, preserved in the archives of the Royal College of Physicians, call it something else. The American Experiment, a place where he could continue work that had gotten him quietly asked to leave Scotland. By the time Jonathan Devlin inherited the property in 1871, the asylum was gone, burned down in 1843 under circumstances that were never investigated. But the land remained in the family, and so did the journals. 17 leather-bound volumes written in William's hand, discovered in a locked trunk in the room beneath the church, stacked in the corner like hymnals. The Historical Society has released exactly 4 pages to public record. The rest are sealed under court order, classified as materials potentially harmful to community psychological welfare. But those 4 pages are enough to understand what William believed he was doing in that building. He wasn't treating mental illness. He was studying inheritance. Specifically, the inheritance of what he called Spiritual corruption. The idea that certain bloodlines carried psychological damage that passed from parent to child like a genetic disease, and that the only way to stop it was intervention at the source. He was experimenting on families, whole families, locked together in isolation, subjected to controlled deprivation, forced into situations designed to break down the boundaries between sanity and collapse. And he was documenting what happened, how long it took, who turned on whom, which family members tried to save the others and which ones participated in their destruction. The journals describe it in clinical detail. Meals withheld, sleep denied. Children separated from parents and returned changed. William believed he could identify the carriers, the family members whose presence infected the others, and that removing them would save the bloodline. Jonathan grew up on that land, played in fields where his great-grandfather had buried the failures. And when Jonathan married Catherine in 1869, when they started having children, when the farmhouse began to fill with the sounds of family life, something in him understood what he'd inherited. Not just land, not just money, but a legacy of belief that some families were meant to end, that some bloodlines carried a poison that couldn't be cured, only contained. The last entry in Jonathan's personal diary, dated November 13, 1887, is 3 sentences long. The signs are undeniable now. What my great-grandfather saw in others, I see in my own children. We will finish what he could not. They didn't die by accident. They didn't die by madness. They died by consensus. That's what the letters prove. The 12 letters discovered in the church's foundation archives, written between Jonathan Devlin and Reverend Thomas Blackwell, who served the previous church in Prospect Hill before it was torn down to build the one that would cover the Devlin's grave. The correspondence spans 6 months, from May 1887 to October 1887, and it reads like a negotiation between a man seeking permission and a spiritual authority willing to grant it. Jonathan wrote about signs. Behaviors in his children he interpreted as evidence of inherited corruption. His oldest son, Daniel, age 16, had begun questioning the existence of God. His daughter, Mary, age 13, had been found reading books on natural philosophy that suggested the earth was older than the Bible claimed. The younger children showed defiance, disobedience, a lack of fear that Jonathan interpreted as moral vacancy, and Catherine, his wife, had stopped attending church, stopped praying over meals, started suggesting carefully that perhaps their children needed education beyond what the local minister could provide. Perhaps they needed to see the world outside Prospect Hill. To Jonathan, these weren't normal growing pains, they were symptoms. Proof that William Devlin's theories were correct, that something rotten moved through bloodlines, passed down like eye color or bone structure, and that it was beginning to show itself in his family. He wrote to Reverend Blackwell asking not for guidance, but for validation. And Blackwell, in letters that are somehow worse than Jonathan's because of their cold pastoral certainty, gave it to him. He quoted scripture, verses about cutting off the hand that causes you to sin, passages about Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac as proof of faith. And then, in a letter dated September 3, 1887, Blackwell wrote something that the Historical Society has tried to keep out of mainstream coverage, but that leaked onto genealogy forums in 2021. If you are certain of the corruption, and if you have prayed for deliverance and received none, then perhaps the deliverance is yours to enact. The Lord does not ask us to shepherd poisoned flocks. He asks us to protect the flock from poison, even when the poison wears the face of our own children. Jonathan built the room in October, hired workers from 2 counties away, paid them in cash, told them he was constructing a root cellar for winter storage. The stone came from his own land, fieldstone pulled from the acres where his great-grandfather's asylum had stood, and the mortar, mixed with ash and bone meal, came from the same place, from the graves that were never marked, from the bodies that were never named. He was literally building his family's tomb with the remains of the families his great-grandfather had destroyed. The town knew. That's the part that makes this more than a family tragedy. That makes it a conspiracy of silence that held for 132 years. Because when the Devlins disappeared, when 9 people vanished from a community of less than 300, someone noticed, multiple someones. But the township meeting minutes show no missing persons report, no inquiry, no investigation. Instead, there's a land transfer, a quiet sale, and then, 4 years later, a church built on the exact spot where the Devlins were last seen, funded by donations from the same families who bought Jonathan's land. They sealed the room with the Devlins inside, poured a foundation over it, and built an altar on top of their grave. And every Sunday for 132 years, congregations gathered above that room to worship, while 9 bodies sat in the darkness below, still holding their silverware, still positioned around a meal that was never meant to nourish, but to sanctify their own extinction. If you're still watching this, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, What would you have done if this was your bloodline? If you discovered your ancestors had participated in something like this, would you want to know the truth, or would you let it stay buried? The excavation site was closed within 72 hours of the discovery, not by historical preservation authorities, not by archaeological protocol, by court order. 3 separate injunctions filed by descendants of the original Prospect Hill families whose names still appear on businesses, on street signs, on the donor plaques of the county library. They argued that continued excavation would cause irreparable harm to community heritage and family reputation. The judge, whose own great-great-grandfather's signature appears on the church's founding charter, agreed. The site was sealed. The remains were removed to an undisclosed location, and the official report, released 6 months later, was 43 pages of careful language that described the discovery as a tragic historical anomaly requiring further study in controlled academic settings. But the forensic team had already documented everything. Thousands of photographs, tissue samples, dental records cross-referenced with baptism certificates that confirmed without question that these were the Devlins. And in those final days before the court shut it all down, they found something else in that room, something that didn't make it into the official report, but that 3 separate members of the excavation crew have spoken about in interviews that mainstream historical outlets refused to publish. There were words on the walls, scratched into the stone with something metal, probably a fork or knife from the table, not random, not the frantic carvings of someone losing their mind in the dark, deliberate, methodical, written in a child's handwriting, based on the letter formation and height of the scratches. They covered an entire section of the wall behind where the youngest children had been seated, and they were all the same phrase, repeated over and over, hundreds of times, carved so deeply into the stone that whoever wrote them had worn the tool down to nothing. Father says this is love. The handwriting analysis suggested it was Mary, the 13-year-old daughter, the one Jonathan had worried about because she asked too many questions, because she read books that made her doubt. She'd spent what might have been days in that darkness, poisoned and weakening, watching her younger siblings die, and she'd used the last of her strength to carve that sentence into stone. Not a plea for help, not a prayer, a documentation evidence, as if she knew even then that someone would eventually find them, and she wanted that person to understand exactly what her father had called the thing he did to his family. The town of Prospect Hill has a population of 473 as of the 2020 census. 18 of the families currently living there can trace their lineage directly back to the original settlers who founded the church over the Devlin grave. When the discovery went public in 2019, when the news crews showed up and started asking questions, those families released a joint statement through a lawyer. It expressed sympathy for the Devlins. It acknowledged the tragedy, and then it said something that legal analysts have noted is very carefully worded. The actions of individuals in 1887 do not reflect the values of our community today, and we believe that disturbing these remains serves no purpose other than to sensationalize a private family matter that should be allowed to rest. A private family matter. 9 people murdered and entombed beneath a church, and the descendants of the people who helped hide it, who built their place of worship on top of it, who spent over a century pretending it never happened, called it private. Called it something that should rest. As if the problem wasn't what was done, but that someone finally looked. The parking structure was never built. The land sits empty now, fenced off, owned by a holding company whose shareholders are anonymous, but whose registered address is a law office in Prospect Hill. There's been talk of turning it into a memorial, a historical marker, something that would acknowledge what happened and ensure it's remembered. But the town council has voted against it 3 times. The most recent vote was last month. The language of the rejection cited concerns about attracting dark tourism and negatively impacting local property values. They're still protecting the secret, even now, even after everything's been found and photographed and DNA confirmed, because acknowledging it fully, memorializing it, would mean admitting that their town, their families, their church, was built on the deliberate erasure of 9 murders. It would mean looking at the street names and the business owners and the old money families and asking, what did your great-great-grandfather know, and when did he know it, and what did he do to keep it quiet? There's one more thing they found in that room, something the court orders couldn't completely bury because too many people had already seen it, already photographed it, already understood what it meant. On the table in the center, between all the plates of uneaten food, sat a Bible open. The pages had degraded, but careful restoration work revealed what passage it had been turned to. Not a verse about salvation, not comfort or hope or redemption. Leviticus 20:9. Anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. Someone had placed that Bible there deliberately. positioned it so that every person at the table could see it. So that as the poison worked through their systems, as the darkness closed in and their muscles stopped responding and their lungs began to forget how to pull air, they would know why this was happening. They would understand that their father believed this was righteous, that he had convinced himself, with the help of a minister and the silent agreement of an entire community, that killing his children was an act of faith, that their questions, their doubts, their simple human desire to grow beyond the boundaries of his control made them worthy of death. And the worst part, the part that keeps genealogists and historians awake, the part that makes this more than just a historical horror story, is that Jonathan Devlin wasn't unique. The research that's emerged since the discovery has identified at least 7 other families in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia between 1870 and 1920 who vanished under similar circumstances. Entire households, gone from census records, property quietly transferred, no investigations, no questions asked. And in 4 of those cases, when researchers started digging into local church records and land surveys, they found the same pattern. New churches built within 5 years of the disappearances, built on land that had belonged to the vanished families, built by congregations that included all the right people with all the right reasons to want certain questions never asked. How many rooms are still down there, sealed under foundations we walk across every day? How many families were disappeared by fathers who believed that obedience was more important than life, who had communities willing to help them enforce that belief with stone and mortar and a century of intentional forgetting? The Devlin descendants, the ones who came from Jonathan's brother Marcus, who died at that table but whose children from a previous marriage survived because they lived with their mother in Philadelphia, have requested that the remains be given a proper burial. They want a headstone. They want names and dates and some public acknowledgement that these people existed, that they mattered, that what happened to them was wrong. The request has been denied 4 times. The official reason is that the remains are still considered evidence in an ongoing historical investigation. The real reason is that putting up a headstone, writing those names in stone where people could see them and ask questions, would make it too real, would make it too permanent, would mean that Prospect Hill could never again pretend that the church was just a church and that the ground beneath it held nothing more than ordinary American soil. Mary Devlin was 13 years old when she carved those words into stone. Father says this is love. She's still down there somewhere, in whatever undisclosed location they moved the remains to, probably in a storage facility with a number instead of a name, catalogued as evidence instead of honored as a victim. And her words are still there too, photographed and filed away in archives that most people will never see. Documentation of the moment a child realized that the person who was supposed to protect her had decided she was better off dead. This is American history, not the history we put on school curriculum or cast in bronze outside courthouses, but history nonetheless. The history of what happens when belief becomes more important than breathing, when community consensus matters more than individual lives, when the appearance of righteousness is valued higher than the reality of mercy. The Devlins died in 1887, but the machinery that killed them, the system of silence and complicity and looking away that made their murders possible, that machinery is still running, still deciding whose stories get told and whose get buried, still choosing protection of reputation over acknowledgement of truth. The excavators dug beneath an old church and found a family frozen at their final meal. But what they really found was a question that no one in Prospect Hill wants to answer. How many more tables are set in the darkness? How many more families are still waiting, hands folded, heads bowed, for someone to finally say their names out loud and call what happened to them by its true name? Not tragedy, not historical anomaly, not private family matter, murder, sanctioned by faith, buried by community, forgotten by design, and the church kept standing for 132 years.